Welcome to the Culture, Faith, and Politics podcast. I'm Pat Kahnke, and I'm here again today with Dave Johnson, formerly pastor Church of the Open Door. Now he's the president of Things That Remain. And we've been talking for a few weeks about Tim Alberta's book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. And so we're going to continue that discussion today with Chapter 5, which is about Robert Jeffress and First Baptist Church in Dallas. So welcome, Dave. It's good to see you.
Good to be back.
So we're discussing this book, and I was going to surprise you today, but I couldn't figure out the technology to do it. I have a song in my head right now that I was going to play for you, but instead I'll just describe it. It's First Baptist Church of Dallas choir and orchestra singing a song that they wrote called Make America Great Again. And it is as bad of a song as it sounds like. I wanted to play the video, but probably we would have gotten blocked anyway if we had tried to play it. It's copyrighted, I'm sure. But imagine every thought that you have in your head of what would it look like and sound like for the First Baptist Church of Dallas to sing a song that they wrote called Make America Great Again. Whatever you're seeing in your head, that's exactly what it is.
Or worse.
So yeah, it's probably even worse than that, but it's going in my head now, you know.
Wow, that's funny. I have not heard the song, but he does mention that. Tim Alberta mentions that in the first chapter.
That's why I looked it up. Yeah.
It's not just the song, it's that the song was sung on Christmas Day, and Donald Trump was the speaker on Christmas Day. And I had read about this before Tim Alberta mentioned in his book, but so Donald Trump is the speaker and he's doing this thing. And at the end of the service that's designed to talk about the birth of Jesus, which is the light of the world and the hope of the world, he tells people we're really dark, but there is hope. And he pointed to himself as being the hope. And the whole congregation starts chanting, USA, USA on Christmas Day.
Right. And so people who've listened to the previous episodes of our podcast here would recognize now that this is who we're going to be talking about today. From that story, it's this guy, Robert Jeffress, and
it's his church, right?
It's his church. Yep. And so I've got Make America Great Again in my head right after Feliz Navidad season has ended. I no longer have Feliz Navidad in my head. Now I've got Make America Great Again. But anyway, so
I go back to the other one.
So Dave, before we jump into this chapter on Robert Jeffress, I wanted to deal with a question that people have asked. Like I like to deal with some of the sort of consistent themes of comments that people make underneath our videos. And one of them they want to deal with today. I'm going to do a longer video on this, so I'm not really going to answer it for myself because I'm going to actually do a long video where I get into this. But we get accused of a couple of competing things that sort of can't both be true. But one of them is we get accused of hating Donald Trump. And the reason that we're doing this is because we're driven by hatred for Donald Trump. So there have been some people who've said that sort of thing. And then another thing that we get accused of, especially you, frankly, is that we aren't making a clear enough distinction between, say, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, because you'll occasionally say things like, well, I don't care. I don't know if you've said like exactly, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but things like, I don't care who you vote for, or I don't care about Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, or, that sort of thing. And I think if we're getting accused of on the one hand, hating Donald Trump, and on the other hand, sort of not hating him enough, we might be in a sweet spot. But I do want to hear kind of how do you, I think those are legitimate things for people to ask about. And how do you process that?
I do. I think they're legitimate too. I don't know entirely where they come from and who said it, but
I think they're sincere,
In fact, I'm working on a book right now called What in God's Name is Going On? And I've been for 7 years and reading and researching. And one of the things that slowed me down is the last thing I want to do is write a book about Donald Trump or what's I care about the church. I don't.
Right.
So when Donald Trump Jr., for instance, at a Turning Point USA event that's full of evangelical young people, pretty much, says the way of Jesus has gotten us nothing. In fact, what he said was, we've been playing softball, they've been playing hardball. We need to start playing hardball. The turn the other cheek stuff, the way of Jesus to turn the other cheek, it's gotten us nothing. I don't. It doesn't. I don't care that he said that. I mean, it bothers me that he said that, but that's what I expect him to say. What bothers me is that 2,000 evangelicals in the auditorium stood up and cheered. Yeah, the ways of Jesus are not going to work, and just gave him permission, and they follow like sheep. That bothers me.
Right.
So my issues. I mean, I have issues about Donald Trump. I don't like him. I don't trust him. I think Donald Trump is dangerous. Well, Joe Biden is too. Not to the whole democracy that we live in. He may be the most immoral president we've ever had, and we have not had morally pure presidents. Jim Wallace, evangelical author, writer, said a fascinating thing. Sojourners, but he wrote a book called Christ in Crisis. Recently, he said, Donald Trump is not immoral, knowing right from wrong and choosing the wrong. That would be immoral. He is rather amoral, lacking any kind of moral compass for his personal or professional life. And that's chilling, and I agree with him. So I'm not driven by hatred at all. I don't, but I'm not going, no, I really like, no, I don't. I don't like him. I think he's dangerous. What bothers me, though, and what drives me, what's gotten me to talk about it, are people who call themselves followers of Jesus who are being duped by him and think, and you know, hear nonsense and go, yes, no. That's my answer.
Yeah, no, that's great. And one of the things that I'll probably say in the video that I make about this, answering it, is that Jesus doesn't tell us not to have enemies. You know, we are going to have enemies. We're going to have people who, on some level, however you define that, some people that we're at odds with, that we're working against in some way, that we need to protect our family from, or we need to, you know, whatever. There's going to be people like this. He tells us to love our enemies. You know, it's like, we're not to hate our enemies. So if I view Donald Trump as a threat to a lot of things that I care about and a lot of people that I care about, I've got to talk about that. And I agree. I think he's dangerous. I think that the whole point is that authoritarians throughout history and around the world have used the religious groups of their day to gain power. And we need to be wise to that. And if somebody's moving in on the church to try to use the church in a way that's for really bad ends, I think I have to view that person as a threat. I need to talk about it. And that's not about hatred. But I'm also, I have strong feelings about him, though I'm not going to deny that either and pretend I don't.
No, we talked about this just before too. Jesus did not hate the Pharisees. Okay. I mean, Jesus is the one who said, love your enemies. He did not hate the Pharisees, but in Matthew 23, he had some pretty strong words. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, you, and what energized and animated his anger toward them was that in I can't remember the verse, but in Matthew 23, he says, you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people who are trying to enter. And like you can't. And so what that meant was, in Jesus' day, if you wanted to meet with God, it was reasonable to assume that I could have an interaction with God at the temple, at the synagogue. But the religious system had become so corrupt that it was kind of like the last place you're going to meet with God is going to be at the temple. And so when Jesus turned over the tables, what he was doing was trying to blow up a system that was keeping people from trying to enter an experience with God with this religious system that had made him jump through all these. Anyway, I'm getting off track, except to say Jesus didn't hate the Pharisees, but he did confront them, and he called them whitewashed sepulchres full of dead men's bones. He didn't
Right.
mince his words. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That's I think it's helpful for people to know what makes us tick and to be reminded of it too, because I mean, uh, there's so many layers to all of this stuff there's so many ways that we could approach talking about these issues. And it's like, I don't want to be another person on the internet who's spewing hatred. But I also don't want to be another person on the internet who's just like pretending we're not in a pretty serious time right now.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
so thanks for that. So yeah, so this chapter 5 from Tim Alberta's book, it starts with a conversation that Alberta has with Robert Jeffress, like I said, from First Baptist in Dallas. And I think it's really important to understand the timing of this first conversation that he has in the book, because the timing is spring of 2021. And it's right after the insurrection, the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. And what's interesting about this interview, Alberta interviews Jeffress several times for the book. But in this interview, it's the only one where Jeffress shows anything like what I would call a tiny bit of doubt about his support for Donald Trump. Just a tiny bit. And
Yeah.
it's
He wondered if they crossed the line.
yeah.
Remember? Right?
Yep. Did I? Yeah. Like,
Yeah.
and did he in some way lose sight of the gospel message a little bit in all of the support? So he had supported Trump from 2015, all through the election, through the Access Hollywood tape, through every scandal. Robert Jeffress was, on Fox News all the time, this huge ministry, and has the ability to sway public opinion, so to the point where he's giving cover to evangelicals for supporting Donald Trump despite these scandals. So he's a real apologist for Donald Trump. And then in 2021, during this interview, he shows just a tiny bit of doubt about it. And what I was struck by is that as I was reading it, just the first time I was reading it, I was thinking he's not going to stick to this, because
Mhm.
I know how these people operate. And it's like when they show you how they operate, you got to believe them. Robert Jeffress is all about power. That's what he's about, is
Mhm.
power. And so he smelled a little bit of blood in the water, after, as many of the other Christian leaders and Republican leaders did when Trump, the insurrection happened. And a lot of them came out and were critical of him, and, oh, this is terrible. And because they smelled a little bit of blood in the water, and they're
Might have
looking
been a
for,
little embarrassed.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And they're thinking, now, is he going to get taken out? At that time, there was a lot of talk that Ron DeSantis was going to be the next heir apparent, to Donald Trump. And so there's this particular interview happens right at that moment where Jeffress, you can tell that he's kind of being careful and feeling his way, like, which way is this going to go? And
Yeah.
so he has a little bit of openness to, oh, maybe we lost sight of some of the important things. And then by the end of the chapter, when Alberta's interviewing him again, he's like, oh, that's all in the past. And he's gung ho on Trump, because Trump had asserted his dominance again over the party. So Jeffress was once again like all in on Donald Trump. And I just want to point that out, that just that simple thing, first of all, that these guys, they're all about power. They show us that every day. They show us with their actions and their words that they're about power. And this is just an example of that. But I want to
Also,
hear your thoughts on
also
Jeffress. Yeah.
it's also I think it's also a personal thing in terms
Mm-hmm.
of like its power and like we're going to change the culture, but it's also influence. Like I feel inflated. Like I
Yeah.
feel inflated when I get invited into
Right.
the Oval Office, and I get and so even that hesitation was like maybe I backed the wrong horse. I'll back that one,
Mm-hmm.
and then he came back anyway. It just
Yeah,
is
one of
so.
the creepiest things in the chapter was in Jeffress's office at the church, where Alberta is talking about sitting in his office, and Jeffress says some of the right things. When he's talking to Alberta, he says some of the right things about, oh, I'm not into the whole conspiracy theory stuff, and some Christians, are like, they're too much into almost a cult of personality around Donald Trump. Like, he'll say some of that stuff, but Alberta points out that on the wall, there's what Jeffress's secretary refers to as a shrine to Donald Trump, where it's like picture after picture after picture of Donald Trump and Robert Jeffress standing next to each. She calls it a shrine to Donald Trump in Jeffress's office. So it's like kind of creepy.
Yeah, it was a little creepy.
But, yeah. So what did you think about, I kind of want to just drop a quarter in you for a minute, and just, you can talk about, some of the things that you got out of this chapter about Robert Jeffress.
Well, I thought it was a great chapter, but I've been reading about Robert Jeffress for 7 years, and almost every book I read that is kind of dealing with this issue. And most of the books I read are by evangelicals trying to sort through this whole thing. And so this, one of the phrases of Jeffress that caught me early on, and you and I did a thing, I think it was the first or second podcast we did, where I kind of went off on, with the phrase that he said was, someone asked him, how could someone like you, who has always said character matters, all of a sudden, when Trump comes up, and everyone knows that he has no character, he is an immoral human being, even Jeffress didn't deny it. His response to that was, well, in that office of president, I want the biggest, baddest, meanest son of a you-know-what as I can find, and most evangelicals think that same way. Right. What's interesting about that, because what he's saying, whether people hear it or not, is that he was not voting for Trump in spite of the fact that he was immoral or a brawler. He was voting for him because he was a brawler. I want the biggest, baddest, meanest son of a you-know-what. Okay, so that's okay if that's what you want, except, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, Pat, what that represents is a bizarre kind of flip for him. And we talked about this relative to some other evangelical leaders in previous podcasts, but in 2007, and this is in the book, in 2007, the Republican primaries were going on, and there were John McCain was running, and Romney was another one, and I don't know what all the dynamics were, but at some point, Jeffress just got all big about, like, Romney can't be the guy. And so what he did was he began to belittle Mormonism and kind of went after Romney. And he began to use his pulpit and every other platform he had to speak from. And I think one of them was Fox News, unless that came later, saying that Romney is not really a Christian. It wasn't even about he doesn't have character, because he kind of did.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if it was in that chapter, but there's a line that says, it's a joke that says, someone saw evangelicals being kind and loving and confused them, thinking they were Mormons. Anyway, so
it was a Babylon Bee headline.
Yeah, that was the Babylon Bee one. Yeah. So he didn't assault Romney because he didn't lack character, wasn't a good family man, and he didn't have any of those. He wasn't paying off porn stars.
Right.
It was that he's not a Christian. In fact, it's a cult. Mormonism's evil. It's dangerous. He kind of went off the thing. And the other thing he said that was fascinating was he started calling out other evangelicals at the time. This is in the book, for their hypocrisy. We've said for the last 8 years that being a Christian, it was in the George Bush administration, and being a Christian who reads their Bible every day is really important. Is it or isn't it? And the whole world is watching, and they see that we're hypocrites, because we used to say it matters, but now it doesn't anymore what a joke, if we support Romney. But then in 2016, the same guy, Jeffress, who in 2007 said everybody else is a hypocrite and we need to be Christians, became one of the most unapologetic supporters of Donald Trump. His church is the one that in 2020 did the Make America Great Again song and had him preach. And that flip of Jeffress's, that went from, it's obviously there's something that has nothing to do with like what I really care about his character, or whether Christians or something else. that's motivating him clearly. It's reflective though of a poll that Alberta mentions in this chapter of the Public Religion Research Institute. Yeah, in 2011, the Public Religion Research Institute did a survey of all people of any kind of religious faith. But the question was, and I'm going to read it right from the book: Can a politician who behaved immorally in their personal life still perform their public duties with integrity? And in 2011, 30%, only 30% of evangelicals said yes, meaning 70% said no. If you have immorality in your personal life, you can't, it'll show up in how you do your job. In 2016, that all flipped to 72% saying you could be immoral in your personal life and we will still trust you as president, which is fascinating because we don't care about immorality anymore, which is actually them admitting we don't think he's moral. But we don't think that matters, but we used to. So that flip was kind of over all of evangelicalism, and it's also reflected in Jeffress, which raises the question that you and I have talked about, and it's in the book. Why? What might explain that shift?
Right. And one of the questions I have about that is, did they ever believe it? Now I can say for myself, I can say that back during the Clinton era, I really did believe that. I was very sincere in opposing Bill Clinton because of the morality piece. And it wasn't necessarily even the sexual morality, but the fact that he lied a lot. And this has been a consistent theme for me, that if you reveal in your character that you're willing to say anything in order to gain an advantage or to get what you want, then how can anyone trust you? And so I would say the same thing about Donald Trump, except Donald Trump, I never in 1,000 years thought I would say that somebody was exponentially worse than Bill Clinton in terms of lying and living in an alternate reality. But I would say he is. And so I'm being consistent in that. It's not even so much about the sexual morality that sometimes people focus on. Although that's also important, it says something about the character. But I think that it's naive for Christians who say to me, for instance, you don't understand politics. You need to support this guy because he's going to. And I think, how naive is it to put all of your trust in a guy who has demonstrated that he will say anything and do anything towards his own ends? And I think it's naive.
And one of the things
when he no longer needs Christians, then they can,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, when you bring up the Clinton thing, I'm with you, Pat, because I remember when Christian leaders came out really strong. Dobson in particular, I think we mentioned him in one of the previous episodes, and he even went so far as to say, I'm really troubled by this end justifies the means things, because one of the questions early was like, you just hate Trump, and how can you say, or somebody else saying, what do you mean you don't care who they vote for? I don't know what the policies are. What I remember about Clinton, and this is what Dobson said, was I hear people saying that because the economy's great and he's really actually doing a good job and this and this and this, that justifies the lack of character. And he was huge about it does matter. And that's why it was so disillusioned. I was a young guy in the 90s. I was, okay, I'm 71 now. I was in my early 40s. But I absolutely was with them. I mean, yeah, character matters. And the economy, I care about the economy, but it matters that you have character, and that all flipped. And it's just bizarre. Like, nobody notices. They must think we're stupid. And we talked about that before. But there's other reasons too why it's shifted. But
so what I want to say about this is that character matters I've learned this over the past several years in a way that I didn't even realize before, because our system, it turns out, is built on a lot of assumptions about the character of somebody who would eventually rise to be president. There are so many things that I didn't realize before are just norms. They're norms that of how a president should act. Things about like interfering with the Justice Department, but you go up and down the list of things that there actually aren't laws. There is a lot of norms that are
Mm,
based on the president and the people that the president surrounds him or herself with, operating out of a certain sort of fundamental understanding of character. And it's if you have somebody in there, what we've learned over the last several years with Donald Trump is that a person whose character you can't trust and who's willing to do it can find all sorts of seams in our system that they
mhm,
can, and he's got a lot of people on his team right now who are just writing about the different seams in the system that they're going to be able to exploit if they
mhm.
take over. And what's bothersome to me about that is there are a lot of Christians who are like, yeah, go for it, thinking he's going to do that on the behalf of Christians. But it's like, no, he's going to do that on behalf of enriching himself and expanding his power. Authoritarianism uh, can look a lot of different ways, but I think in Donald Trump's case, the way it will look if he becomes president again, given the kind of character he has, it'll look like Vladimir Putin, where it's basically a corrupt system. He'll corrupt the system in order to enrich himself, and it'll be corruption all the way down. That's what eventually happens if you don't hold him accountable. So Christians who vote for him need to hold him accountable. The party that supports him needs to hold him accountable, and I'm not seeing that happen.
Right.
That's where some of my alarm comes from.
Well, one of the norms that is easy to identify. You talked about them; they're kind of vague or something. Well, one is, and it's something that Americans have been proud of forever, is
Mm-hmm.
this peaceful transition of power.
Right,
I mean, what one was it? George Bush and uh, Gore, Al Gore. I came down to like that was a. I mean, if Gore wanted to go ballistic and do, there was a peaceful transition of power,
right.
and Gore let it go. And this is like that was one of the most chilling things for him to continue to hang on to this lie
Right,
about a
and he
stolen
still does.
election. It's I know he does, and people still
Yeah,
believe it. And I don't have the energy to try to talk him out of it. It was a lie,
right.
and it was not a peaceful transfer of power. It was the
You're right.
most anyway. So that's an example of a norm. I don't know if
Mhm.
that's in the Constitution, but it's something that is, and I think people are expecting that if he runs again and he gets through all of his indictments, what is it, 90 something?
Mhm.
That there will be another one that he's going to do
Right.
the same thing. That it's
Oh, for
automatic.
sure.
It doesn't
For
matter
sure.
how unless he wins, you won't contest that.
Right. And this is why character matters. And bringing it back to Jeffress, the thing about Robert Jeffress, the issue I have with him, I mean, among many, is that he is somebody who's very powerful and has the ability to sway public opinion to say, pay no attention to this character thing.
Man behind the
It's
curtain.
not just Robert Jeffress, but it's Jeffress and a whole bunch of other Christian leaders who've allowed that to happen, to where now that survey that you talked about, where it's flipped, where people have said, 72% say, oh, it doesn't matter what their character is. That's directly the result of Christian leaders not standing up and speaking the truth. So,
Well, it's interesting because in the book, Alberta actually asked Jeffress to explain the flip,
mhm,
and it came down to two words. Jeffress said this: um, under siege.
mhm,
And what he meant by that was that we have communicated, and I think he believes that we are under siege, like they're coming to get us. The government, when COVID hit, the government's going to shut you down, and people exploited that. Like the government's come, it's about you're going to lose your liberties. They're going to close the churches. Um, uh,
and can I just
Trump has
interrupt for a
even,
second?
yeah, yeah.
Um, I I just want to say I don't give him the credit of actually believing that. Robert Jeffress does not believe that. He says
Oh,
it. I don't think he believes it. It's a tool that he uses to,
Well,
stay in
yes.
power. So,
Yeah. Well, I don't know if they believe it or not, but I do know, and it comes out in later chapters, that very intentionally there is a strategy. In fact,
mhm.
later on, they talk about some of the fundraising tactics of
Right.
various is the only way to get any. They'll just say it out loud. The only way to get money is to scare them, and
That's
like they're
that's
coming
why
at
I
you.
say I don't.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah, we're in, and
that's
so.
why I don't want to give them the credit of saying they believe it, because they've made it so clear that it's a tool that they
But
use.
here's the thing psychologically, and it's a tactic. And you've used the word authoritarian a few times, and it really is frightening that it's a tactic on that end of things. That if you can frighten people, they're coming after you. And evangelicals have been a target of this, and they've bought it. Sadly, it's incredible how if you really believe they're going to come after all your freedoms and they're going to close your churches, that they are willing to jettison their values um, to protect their values. And
Hmm.
it justifies, if they're coming after us, it justifies anything we do. And you'll hear rhetoric, you'll hear things that say desperate times, desperate measures. The rules have changed because they've gotten even worse. And so
Hmm.
it justifies whatever it is we do. And well, maybe it does if you're just quit calling yourself a Christian.
Right.
That's fine.
Right.
I get that thinking. I don't think that's
Mhm.
insane. Just quit calling yourself someone who's following the way of Jesus
Right.
if you're willing to
Exactly.
throw out all of that stuff. Because and then there's this another narrative underneath that is that we're being persecuted.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're
That's
being
what I was going to get to
persecuted.
next. Yep.
And I mean, he had some things in there. I don't have the time to go into them all. You can read the book. But the
Right.
Johnson Amendment, there was all this. They've weaponized the IRS and are coming after churches. And then he just documented, no, they're not. No, they're not.
Right.
So the weaponization and the persecution, oftentimes the stuff that you'll hear among
Hmm.
these MAGA rallies and stuff are either exaggerated or fabricated. Um, and but here's my thing. I don't think what we're experiencing is near persecution. I mean,
Right.
go look, read the Bible, and you won't find about persecution. We've gone too long already in this videotape. This was years ago. We had a men's ministry, a bunch of young guys, really good guys. And I remember a couple of them coming up to me. This has nothing to do with Trump, way before. They're going to
Hmm.
come and take our tax exempt status. We got to fight. We got to. And I remember telling them, I said, what if they did? It might be the best thing that ever happened to us. We lose our building, wouldn't we? And we'd have to
Right.
learn what it means to be faithful and true to God in the middle of loss. And both, Pastor, you'd lose your job. I know. What if
Hmm.
it called out of me some things that I don't want that. I don't want that.
Right.
But
Sure.
what if we do get persecuted? Okay,
Right.
I think some of the things that are fabricated and exaggerated are ridiculous and they're manipulative and lies. But what if
Hmm.
we do? What do we do if we are? What does the Word of God say? I mean, honestly,
Right.
First Peter. You can maybe elaborate on this after I go off on this, but Peter is writing in Rome to the church in Asia Minor, present day Turkey, and that church, those people were going through real persecution, like torture,
Right.
physical threats of death. And here's the kind of thing. In fact, in First Peter 1, that's the place where it says, that and Jesus being reviled, he reviled not again. Okay, I know that verse. Probably you'll all know that verse.
Hmm.
Well, the verse before that says this, and this is the example for you to follow. This is the example for you who are right now being persecuted,
Right.
not just losing your tax exempt status. You're
Right.
about to be fed the lions. Here's
Right.
being reviled. He reviled not again. And being attacked, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to the one who judges rightly, the living and the dead. I don't think we believe that for a minute. That's my
Right.
confrontation on the church, because I don't think that'll never work. What do you mean by work? It'll never work, Donald Trump Jr. Anyway.
Right. Right. Yep. And what I've said for a while now about this thing about persecution. For one thing, I like that Tim Alberta starts the chapter with a quote from Jesus from the Gospel of John, where he says, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first."
Mhm.
And so Jesus is setting the expectation right from the start that persecution or being disliked on his behalf, on the very minor level, is normal and expected for a follower of Jesus Christ. And so you see actual persecutions today happening around the world. And what I've said for a long time about white American evangelicals is what they're experiencing is a slight loss of privilege,
Mhm.
and they're calling it persecution. It's a slight loss of privilege. That's what it is.
Well, I
And
would
and
say,
calling
Pat,
it persecution.
I agree. I agree. What I would say is that, and let's just put some words on this and validate something, because I don't think it's persecution. We do have an antagonistic culture. Our
Mm-hmm.
culture is antagonistic to Christians, evangelicals in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are for, some are like, they're not legitimate, but some of the antagonism, it's not always because we've been so kind and gentle and loving.
Right.
It's
Right.
um it's let your forbearing spirit, Philippians 4 verse 5, let your forbearing spirit be the first thing people see about you. Remember that? We have talked
Mm-hmm.
about this before.
Yep.
Well, what's the first thing people see about us? If 81% of white evangelicals, everything I've heard, podcasts that aren't Christian evangelical,
Mm-hmm.
like they're just talking about stuff, they always talk about the evangelical block. The first thing they see is this political thing. They're not, the first thing they think about when they think about us is not, man, they're expansive in their thinking and compassionate in their love and kind
Mm-hmm.
and short to anger, and it's not what they think, and that makes
Mm-hmm.
me sad. So
Yeah. And I'll say about that, the idea of voting as a block on issues, I think, that's where we've gotten off track in the first place, is to focus on issues. And we've talked about this. Um, there are certain issues that are considered Christian issues. Well, politicians know how to manipulate you based on issues. If we say the right things about this issue or that issue, then we've got them locked up and we can get 81%. Wouldn't it be amazing if Christians were the people that politicians would say, wow, I really can't get caught lying about this because I'm going to lose the Christians.
mm,
I can't get caught being abusive in this policy because we're going to lose the Christians. Regardless of what the issue is, wouldn't that, to me, would be salt and light? If it's like, wow, there's this voting block out there that's actually going to hold me accountable for telling the truth and not being abusive, what a change that would bring about in our
yeah,
country. So next week, after that Pollyanna statement, but next week I do want to talk about chapter 6, which gets into persecution more, and it's a chapter where Tim Alberta is talking with a bunch of people at a conference, Christian leaders, who are actually trying to figure out, how do we live in this world? How do we deal with persecution and stuff like that without becoming what we oppose? But
mhm,
so it's actually a positive chapter, talking to some people who are trying to do some good things, some innovative things, and I think it's really good that there's a mixture in this book of people like that, or it's like, it's not just like trashing on evangelicals. It's actually showing the full spectrum of, here's people who are really trying a different way. So that's next week. And so next week we will be talking more about persecution in that context. So thanks, Dave. Thanks for this. And we'll see you in a few days. We'll talk through chapter
yep.
6.